Testing. This is good. Yeah.
Tim, they're saying it's not really on. Welcome, everyone. We are going to get started in just a few minutes. And if you are joining us online, we had a slight delay. We were transitioning from the previous event that was here. So we are going to get started in just a few minutes. You can talk amongst yourselves for like 2 more minutes. Do I need to? Welcome, everyone. Go ahead and find yourself a seat. We're running on just a slight delay. So if you're joining us online, know that the presentation will be starting momentarily. Thank you for your patience. Nope. Okay. Oh, now I can hear it. Excellent. Welcome. On behalf of the Friends of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House Lecture Series, here in person and online. I'm Christina Hartlieb, the Executive Director at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. Our sponsors for the 2023 Lecture Series are longtime Friends member Alan Bernard, the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House Board, the Walnut Hills Branch Library, and the First Unitarian Church. They have been incredible in their willingness to accommodate us and our programs, so we thank them all for their support. Thanks also to our volunteers and board members who are running the AV equipment and who checked you in today. We're bringing you today's lecture free, but please feel free to support our mission financially if you are able. While members of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House do enjoy these programs without an extra charge, if you are not a member yet, we do have our donation box out front if you are able to contribute. So we'll have the presentation and then a question and answer time. Today's presenter is Chris Hanlin. He's a local historian and architect in Cincinnati. He's co-author of the book Bicycling Through Paradise, Historical Tours Around Cincinnati. Chris has given lectures on African American cemeteries at Cincinnati's Mercantile Library and at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. He's a former longtime volunteer in the Genealogy Library of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. He's on the Black History Sites Advisory Committee of the Cincinnati Preservation Association, and he's also becoming a regular presenter for us and our lecture series, specializing on aspects of Cincinnati's African American history. So let's please welcome Chris Hanlin.
Thanks, Christina. I want to talk about the people who made Madisonville. Yeah, can we have the first slide, please? There we go. I want to talk about the people who made Madisonville and what makes Madisonville, as it has often described itself. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah. Could we have the next slide? There we go. Yeah, there we go. And what makes Madisonville, as it has often described itself, a good place to live. We begin, of course, by recognizing that European settlers were not the first people in Madisonville. This is an archaeological map. Madisonville's near the top, and the red symbols are mounds and other earthworks because the mound builders were here, and then the Shawnee and other groups. European settlers begin arriving in Madisonville in the 1790s, and in 1809, Madisonville becomes the first village incorporated in Columbia Township, and the streets are laid out. Madisonville remains a sleepy farm community into the 1860s when the railroad comes through, opening it up as a de facto neighborhood of Cincinnati. In 1910, the city of Cincinnati annexes Madisonville, so we're no longer a separate town. Now we're a neighborhood within Cincinnati. Today, there are a little more than 9,000 people in Madisonville. The demographics in the 2020 census are a little bit difficult to figure because the census tract boundaries do not align with neighborhood boundaries. But as close as I can figure, Madisonville today is a little over 50% white, just under 40% black, the rest Hispanic, Asian, mixed race. So pretty close to half and half white and non-white, but majority white. And that's quite different. As little as 25 years ago, Madisonville was 2/3 non-white. So that's quite a big shift that has happened because new people moved into the neighborhood, people like me, and even so, Madisonville remains more diverse than many of its surrounding communities. Madisonville is encircled by Marymount, Fairfax Hyde Park, Oakley, Kennedy Heights, Kenwood, Madeira, Indian Hill, which are much wider communities. So Madisonville retains a distinctive identity as a diverse community, even though we are not as different from our neighbors as we used to be. So the question is, how did Madisonville get to be a diverse community? Because it didn't really start out that way. The earliest African American in Columbia Township, who I can put a name to, is Peter Rucker, or Rucker, who appears as a head of household in the census of 1820. He had a wife and children with him. We don't know their names, but Peter Rucker disappears before the census of 1830, and I don't know what happened to him. In the censuses of 1830, 1840, 1850, you can count the African Americans in Columbia Township on the fingers of one hand. In 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, the census taker in Madisonville filled out all of the columns to write down everyone's name, age, birthplace, occupation, but left the column for race entirely blank, apparently because there were no distinctions to be made since everyone was white. We do know that there were some African Americans coming through Madisonville via the Underground Railroad. One of our primary streets is Wetzel Avenue, which was named for Henry B. Wetzel, who lived on that road. You can see the top floor of his house just beyond the railroad bridge. And there's a book in 1912 that says Henry Wetzel was one of the few men who, before the war, protected the runaway slaves and assisted in their conveyance to a point across the line of safety, sheltering many of them on his farm, which was on the course of their journey. When the Civil War broke out, Henry B. Wetzel was already 43 years old, which was pushing the upper limit for age limit for enlistment. So he told the recruiting officer that he was 34 and enlisted anyway, and served with great distinction until the end of the war. Madisonville as a whole made a very strong showing in Civil War enlistment. Dozens of Madisonville men volunteered. They came from the town's leading families, not just Wetzel, but Bramble, Stewart, Ward. Many of them re-upped when their original terms were over. The local Methodist minister, Levi Miller, volunteered as a chaplain and was assigned, perhaps asked to be assigned, to an African American unit. And immediately after the Civil War, there's an influx of Native Americans coming into Madisonville. The census of 1870 shows a total black population of 72 people and 12 black heads of household, in addition to individual African Americans living in white households. Virtually all of these people said they'd been born in the South, mostly Kentucky. The men described their occupations as farmhands and laborers. The women described their occupation as keeping house. Two of the 12 black heads of household in 1870 were property owners, and interestingly, 3 of them were veterans of the Union Army who had served with what was called the USCT, the United States Colored Troops. One of them was Harrison Hubbard, bit of whose service record you see here. And the white veterans and the black veterans, they knew each other. They had not served in the same units, but they got to know each other in Madisonville. There are at least a couple of instances of a white veteran hiring a black veteran as a farmhand, or hiring the son of a black veteran. And it seems possible that a shared history of military service helped African Americans gain a foothold in Madisonville. So Madisonville now has an African American community. This is new. In Walnut Hills, for instance, that's a different kind of community. There had been a large and vibrant pre-Civil War black population. Certainly that was the case downtown. In Madisonville, this is all new, but that community gains ground quickly. By 1873, there's a black church in Madisonville that is today still exists and is today known as Gaines United Methodist Church. Tradition says it met initially in the upstairs of this building on Madison Road. By 1883, we've got a black cemetery, United American Cemetery, originally called the United Colored Cemetery, and quite a remarkable place. And by 1886, the Leonard subdivision is laid out. This happened when a wagon maker named Mahlon Leonard, who was white, subdivided his 10-acre tract near Duck Creek, laid out streets and lots, and began selling the lots to people who were African American. This was an unusually welcoming arrangement for the time. It may be relevant that Mahlon Leonard's son, Edwin Leonard, was one of Madisonville's Civil War soldiers. And this quickly becomes the all-black neighborhood that will be known as Dunbar. By 1887, Madisonville has a black school teacher. Her name is Jenny Moore Bryan, and she will have a long career with the school. You can see her here seated center left with the rest of the Madisonville school teachers in 1887. She'll have a long career teaching English and French and Latin and other subjects. By 1888, Gaines Chapel now has its own building. And by the 1890s, you're starting to see the earliest known black-owned businesses in Madisonville and the beginnings of an educated black middle class. This is Eli Gifford's barbershop. He's the earliest known black business owner in Madisonville. His barbershop appears in village directories as early as 1891. Mildred Crawford married a man named Phocion Hopper, who was one of Madisonville's Civil War veterans. She was originally from Berea, Kentucky. They moved to Madisonville. She returned to Berea to take classes at Berea College and then came back to Madisonville and worked as a nurse. This is Henry John Smith, one of the first Pullman porters in Madisonville, who purchased this home on East Ledge Avenue. And Elihu Parks is the earliest known black business owner in the Dunbar area. He was born in 1855. He also attended Berea College. He came to Dunbar, and by 1899, he had his own cement contracting business. White allies during the 1890s played a very important role. This is William B. Shattuck, Civil War veteran, came to Madisonville in the 1870s. In 1897, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. One of the first things he did was to nominate a cadet from his district, Cincinnati, an African-American student named Richard Bundy, to be a cadet at the Naval Academy at Annapolis. Well, there weren't any black cadets at Annapolis. This made national news. The clipping you see here is from the New York Times. Shattuck was informed that some white cadets at Annapolis were threatening to resign over the appointment, and Shattuck said, "Let them resign and be damned." This is John Morgan Walden, radical abolitionist, and in the post-war era was in Madisonville as an officer of the Methodist Freedmen's Aid Society, helping to raise money for the education of African Americans. This is Sarah Peabody. In 1895, long before women won the right to vote, Sarah Peabody ran for school board in Madisonville, and she won. She immediately moved to bring to Madisonville an important early childhood education program that had been successful in Cincinnati, and the Cincinnati Enquirer, reporting on Mrs. Peabody's activities, said, "Pessimistic croakers on women's suffrage received a blow this week." So, as we enter into the early 1900s, by 1901, Madisonville has an amateur semi-pro black baseball team, the Madisonville Armintas, and in 1902, Madisonville gets a new high school. This is the period when Sarah Peabody is still on the school board. The school was designed by Cincinnati's greatest architect, Samuel Hannaford. It was regarded as a model school, one of the best in Hamilton County. And when we look at the photo of the class of 1902, on the right there we see our educator, Jenny Moore Bryan, now vice principal of the Madisonville High School. Jenny Bryan was truly a force of nature. In 1900, she was elected president of the Madisonville Audubon Society. She wanted to improve her French language skills, so she spent the summer of 1902 in Paris. In 1904, she became the first known black member of a women's study club in Madisonville called the Monday Club. And by 1905, Jenny Moore Bryan was principal of the Madisonville High School. Now, this is interesting. By contrast, the city of Cincinnati did not have a black woman as a high school principal until 9 years later, when Jenny Porter became the founding principal at Stowe School. But even so, Stowe had an all-black faculty, all-black student body. Jenny Bryan was high school principal in Madisonville 9 years before that, supervising white teachers and teaching a mostly white student body. For an African-American woman at the time, it was a stunning level of authority. In the 1910s, we start to see some interesting people move into Madisonville. This is Phoebe Allen. She moved to Madisonville in 1915 after what had already been a long career. She was born into slavery in Kentucky. In the post-Civil War era, she became an evangelist, traveling around to backwoods Kentucky communities in Kentucky to preach. She came to Cincinnati, first Covington, then Cincinnati. She became one of the very first women in the United States to serve as a deaconess in the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, the AME Church. She became one of the first juvenile in juvenile court, working for them, working with a probation officer, in the juvenile court, working with young people. And then she became involved in the women's suffrage movement. In 1913, the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune reported that colored women of the city are organizing suffrage clubs under the direction of Phoebe Allen. The following year, there was another news article that mentioned that Walnut Hills was a particular focus of her organizing activities. She moved to Madisonville the year after that, 1915. Soon after that, she retired from the probate court, but while she was in Madisonville, she was still giving speeches about women's voting rights and temperance and the need to clean up county government. Miranda Bolden Parker also came to Madisonville in 1915. There was actually an article about her in the Cincinnati Enquirer this morning. She was the widow of the great Underground Railroad conductor John P. Parker, after whom our elementary school is named. Miranda and John P. Parker lived in Ripley, Ohio. He died there. She decided to move to Cincinnati. And so Miranda Bolden Parker moved first to Norwood, and she was hounded out of Norwood by racist harassment. So she came to Madisonville and spent the last 5 years of her life in this little house at the end of Muchmore Avenue. One other interesting thing was happening in Madisonville in the 19-teens. A real estate developer named Robert Cresap, who was white, laid out a new subdivision that he said would be for the exclusive use of colored people. Now, this is a disturbing thing, a white real estate developer laying out a segregated black subdivision. And yet, he purposefully said he wanted to name it after Frederick Douglass. It would be called Douglass Park, and if it had been completed, the main street would have been Booker T. Washington Circle. Most of this plan was not complete. One street was built, a street called Amy Avenue. And we'll talk about Amy Avenue a little bit more in just a minute, but for the moment, I just want to note that in the 19-teens, lots on Amy Avenue were selling briskly. As we enter the 1920s, this is maybe the heyday of Madisonville for both black and white citizens. This is an article from the Cincinnati Post in 1923 saying that Madisonville is the Boston of Cincinnati. And the author says they don't mean that people in Madisonville are snooty like Cincinnati. He means something else. This applies to Madisonville only in respect to the literary attainments of her people. For Madisonville, despite the large number of books she takes from the library and the legion of shell-rimmed glasses worn by her inhabitants, is a friendly community. In 1926, Wendell Dabney, the great journalist, writes his landmark work, Cincinnati's Colored Citizens. He identifies 7 neighborhoods in the Cincinnati region that are the most important ones for African Americans. And it's the West End, Walnut Hills, of course, to the East End, Cumminsville, Madisonville, College Hill, and Lockland. Dabney estimated that there were perhaps between 300 and 400 homes in Madisonville that were owned by African Americans. This means that African Americans were still a fairly small minority of the total Madisonville population, but still a significant presence. And those people included people like Flora Hector, who owned a rooming house downtown, but was also running a beauty salon in Dunbar. and Eleazar Blue, who Dabney called one of the most brilliant and progressive young ministers in the city. Within the churches, there were important lay leaders like Anna Lee Taylor, who was a Sunday school superintendent and fundraiser at Gaines, and Priscilla Haley, seen here holding a shovel at a groundbreaking ceremony, also at Gaines. Alice Mae Easton Leland was the first black woman to graduate from the University of Cincinnati in 1897. Now, she eventually moved to Walnut Hills, and she's better known there. There's an affordable housing complex that is named for her. But before she went to Walnut Hills, she lived for a pretty good number of years in Madisonville at this home you see here on Madison Road that's now gone, and she is buried here in Madisonville. There are also in the 1920s some pretty interesting white people living in town. This is Louise McLaughlin. When she was younger, she had become world famous as a ceramic artist. She retired to Madisonville. She moved into a house that she designed herself, which she shared with her longtime companion, Margaret Hickey. And while she was here, she wrote a book that was a fascinating page-by-page comparison of world political events with world artistic events. It was called An Epitome of History. This is Annette Covington. She was a painter. That's a self-portrait. Born and raised in Madisonville on the street that's now called Covington Avenue. It was named for her family. She moved away to New York to study art, and then she came back to Madisonville, lived here for the rest of her life, and painted. That's Fountain Square you see here. And she actually did quite a lot of work and was really rather good. And this is Ethel Glenn Heyer, who the Cincinnati Enquirer on at least 2 occasions called one of America's foremost women composers. Born and raised in Madisonville, she moved to New York for her career, but often returned to Madisonville, especially to play for events at the Madisonville Music Club. If I could go back in time to attend one social event in Madisonville, I should say, Jenny Moore Bryan, also by the 1920s, is writing poetry, publishing it in the newspapers. And in 1929, she publishes a collection of her poems called High Tower. It's published by Open Sesame Press, and where are they located? They're located in Madisonville. If I could go back in time to attend one social event in Madisonville history, I would go back to Valentine's Day 1929 to this building to a joint meeting of the Monday Club and the Madisonville Music Club. Louise McLaughlin unveiled a painting, Jenny Moore Bryan read a poem, Annette Covington unveiled a painting, and Ethel Glenn Heyer played a composition. So that really must have been something. So Madisonville at this time, it's got this vibe, right? It's this kind of brainy, artistic, progressive community. As we enter into the 1930s, 40s, 50s, the black community in Madisonville is strengthening. Dr. Braxton Cann was the first African-American physician on the staff of Cincinnati General Hospital, now the University of Cincinnati Medical Center. That happened in 1933. A long distinguished career as a physician, many professional boards, lots of outside activities. He served on the Cincinnati Boxing and Wrestling Commission, an amazing man. And with him is his wife, Reber Simpkins Cann, an important civil rights activist in her own right. She worked with the NAACP, the Urban League, the National Council of Negro Women. And this photo, Reber Cann is the woman second from right, and that white woman in the center in front of the doorway, that's Mamie Eisenhower. Jerry Maxey was an important union organizer. By 1947, when he was 32 years old, he was head of the Foundry Council of the United Auto Workers, supervising the union interests of 80,000 foundry workers. And by that time, he was living on Desmond Avenue in Madisonville. In 1958, he opened a funeral home, Maxey's Funeral Home, which for many years was one of the most visible and important black-owned businesses in Madisonville. And in 1959, he was named as the JC's Father of the Year. Trinity Missionary Baptist Church is a vital, still a vital institution in Madisonville. They built a new building that was begun under the pastorate of Reverend Lyman Ingraham, It was completed in 1941 and seen here. The architect was Edward E. Birch, one of Cincinnati's first black architects. He lived in Walnut Hills, but his earliest known public building is there in Madisonville. This is a photo of the graduating class of the University of Cincinnati Medical School in 1936. And one of these persons is not like the others. That would be Lucy Oxley. She was the only woman in her class. She was the only black person in her class. She was the first black woman to receive a medical degree from the University of Cincinnati, went on to a distinguished career as a physician. Her practice was in Walnut Hills. Her home was in Madisonville. This is Nicholas Neblett, who was a Tuskegee Airman. He was one of only a handful who was graduated as a bombardier, navigator, and pilot. He lived in Cincinnati prior to the war. In the post-war period, he came to Madisonville, lived for many years on Kenwood Road. He went to work for General Electric. They hired him as a janitor, and he worked his way up to being a foreman in the test fighter division. Cecil McLean was a great athlete. He was the only black football player at Withrow High School in 1941. He went on to play American Leagues baseball, including a stint with the Chicago American Giants in 1947. He was dogged by a knee injury, which kept him out of the white major leagues. His obituary calls him a longtime resident and community activist of Madisonville. Garvey Sanders, Sr., was on the Cincinnati police force. He was a patrol officer beginning in 1947. He was chair of the National Coalition of Neighborhoods, and he was a knot-hole baseball coach. So there's just this deep, deep bench of talent in Madisonville at this time. There are also a lot of black-owned businesses. This is David Benet, the dean of Madisonville Barbers. Everybody knew Benet's barber shop. It was another of the most visible black-owned businesses in Madisonville. Many of you will recognize the building. That's the Benet Barber Shop building because it still exists and is today the Bad Tom Smith Brewery. And as you go north, that building's right at the corner of Madison and Wetzel. As you go north on Wetzel Avenue, there was a significant black-owned business district. Businesses including the Hut Cafe, which was run by Mildred Orr, and Cox Cleaners, run by Gladys Cox. And Juliet Allen ran a small grocery just 2 blocks over on Desmond Street. Back on Wetzel, Rosalie Moore, who had served in the Second World War with the Women's Army Corps, was running a small candy shop. And there were others, the Brown Pelican Bar, the Willis Billiard Academy, Duncan's Radiator Shop. Really quite an amazing center of activity. I think that many people, white people especially, who grew up in Madisonville in the 1950s tend to remember that time very fondly as a time when everything in Madisonville was sort of okay. Well, of course, things were not okay. Things were nowhere close to okay. Of course, the woman on the left who was running a grocery store in Madisonville did not have the same access to capital as the woman on the right who was also running a grocery store in Madisonville. The tensions within the community come to light in 1959 when Madisonville celebrated the 150th anniversary of its founding, the sesquicentennial. And there was a tremendous multi-day celebration, a big parade, lots of events. And this is all documented in this enormous album, the Madisonville Sesquicentennial Album, that's on display at the Madisonville Public Library. And the album's just huge. And you turn page after page after page of these big, big pages. Madisonville at this time was about a quarter of the population was black, and you would never know it looking at this album. Page after page after page. Profiles of white businesses, interviews with white business leaders, on and on and on. You finally get to a photo that includes some black faces, and it's a photo of the Children's Pet Judging Contest. And all of the kids who are winning prizes are in the front row and are white. So check the little girl in the plantation dress who is holding a trophy in one hand, and her other hand is holding a leash that goes to her cat. and there's a kid with a bunny, and there's a kid with a collie dog. To see the black faces, you have to look in the second row, where no one is holding a trophy and no one is smiling. Now, this little girl in the dress, she's probably still around. She'd be, 70? And she presumably has good memories, as well she should, of the day when Skippy won the cat contest. The issue is larger, right? Many people started to notice that at the sesquicentennial, black people patronized the booths run by black or individuals and organizations. White people patronized the booths run by white individuals and organizations. So at this time, the central area of Madisonville was physically actually pretty well integrated, but culturally separate. And we see the divisions in the community more clearly when we look at the two all-black enclaves of Madisonville, to the east and to the west, right? They're on the edges of Madisonville, Dunbar to the west, Amy Avenue to the east. Dunbar was an amazing community. The beating heart of the community was the New Mission Baptist Church, founded in 1907. It was a very blue-collar community. It was full of solid citizens like Samuel Herskins, who worked for a moving company. What Dunbar did not have, it did not have water lines in the streets. Residents had outhouses. In 1905, the village of Madisonville installed a public hydrant nearby and told residents that they could carry water from the public hydrant to their homes. Well, a woman named Cordelia Rollins, who lived in this house here, she got tired of carrying water 300 feet from the public hydrant to her home. So when Madisonville was annexed by the city of Cincinnati in 1910, Mrs. Rollins went to city officials and asked for a water line to be installed in Corsica Place, the major residential street of Dunbar. The city refused. So Mrs. Rollins got a petition signed by all of her neighbors, and the city refused. Cordelia Rollins waged a 30-year campaign to get a water line in Corsica Place. And she won, but when she won, the utility officials informed her that she would be charged a $100 assessment fee, she personally, for the installation of the water line. Cordelia Rollins agreed. She paid installments on that $100 assessment for the rest of her life. Her son Wiley paid the final installment in 1940, the year after she died. We can see the same sort of environmental injustice when we look at the Dunbar incinerator. This was a large garbage incinerator at the end of Hetzel Place, about where the salt dome is now. This was what the city did before they transitioned to landfill-based trash management. And this was a big active facility, and every day that smokestack would leave a thin layer of ash on every outdoor surface, picnic tables, drying laundry, cars, all of it. The Dunbar incinerator was not the only one in Cincinnati. There were a couple of others. The other big one was on Cruikshank Road in Western Hills, which was a white neighborhood. By the 1960s, there were finally meaningful protests against these facilities. And in 1969, the Cincinnati Enquirer reports, thus the outcry of protests by Western Hills families finally led the city to take drastic action to slash the pollution put out by the Cruikshank Road incinerator. City official Charles E. Schuman noted that the city spent $250,000 to install that scrubber equipment. And then the city balked at the equivalent cost to install the same pollution controls in Dunbar. The same article goes on. Yes, it's true that the Dunbar incinerator is violating the air pollution control standards with its fly ash, Schuman said. But when you're talking about $250,000, the city has to think long and hard about it. Shouldn't have been that hard. So that's what's going on in Dunbar. Okay, what's going on the other side of town at Amy Avenue? You can see on the map here, that's Madison Road coming in from the left. It sort of dead ends into Camargo Road, which goes up Indian Hill. But there's this narrow little spur that continues out further. That's East Fork Road. And going up north from there, that little narrow road that's Amy Avenue. And if you drive out East Fork Road today, I should mention, in the 1950s, there were dozens of houses on Amy Avenue. And if you drive out the road, East Fork Road today, there's still a street sign that says Amy Avenue, and there's a chain across the roadbed, and there's a no trespassing sign. And if one were to ignore that sign and walk up the roadbed, it's heavily overgrown, and as you walk up the roadbed, it climbs steeply up the slope of Indian Hill, and you start to see retaining walls and steps, and then you start to see house foundations, and they're all over, and this is all that's left of Amy Avenue. So what happened? Well, Amy Avenue was like Dunbar. It was built without water lines in the streets. And of course, utility lines can always be added later, but some utility, some municipality has to want to add them. And that was the problem. Nobody wanted Amy Avenue. It was just outside the boundaries of the city of Cincinnati. It was outside the boundaries of Indian Hill. It was just in an unincorporated area of Columbia Township. During the 1930s, Amy Avenue residents repeatedly asked the city of Cincinnati to annex their street so that it would be eligible for road repairs and utilities, and the city refused. The lack of water lines meant that the residents had cisterns, they had outhouses. It meant something else too. It meant there weren't any fire hydrants in the road, right? None closer than East Fork Avenue. So in the event of a fire, a responding company might have to string together hoses for upwards of 2,000 feet to get from the closest hydrant to the fire. Worse, it's not even clear which fire company is supposed to respond. In 1950, the home of Catherine Willis caught fire. The Hamilton County dispatcher got a phone call. He called fire companies in Silverton, Madison Place, and Indian Hill, all of whom refused to respond because they said that the area was outside their jurisdiction. A fire company from Cincinnati did respond, but by that time the house had been destroyed and the suburban fire companies could have gotten there sooner. Over the next some number of years, Amy Avenue experienced numerous devastating house fires, including this one in 1953 that killed Henry Saunders. Eventually, officials from Columbia Township went to the residents of Amy Avenue and said, tell you what, if you will organize a volunteer fire department for just Amy Avenue and one block of East Fork, we will give you firefighting equipment, we will give you a fire truck. The residents said, okay. Volunteer fire company was organized, but within a couple of years it had disbanded. In 1957, a reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer went out to Amy Avenue and asked, why did your fire company disband? So they took the reporter and they showed him the fire truck that they had gotten from the township. And this is the truck. There we go. And the Enquirer said, it's a converted light truck, 7 years old. It carries only 25 to 50 gallons of water. Its hose is rotten, its chemical tanks are empty, and it just can't climb some of those hills. A local resident named Ernest Davidson said, they just don't realize how bad the equipment really is. There's no axe, no ladder, and there are not even wrenches with which to fit the hoses together. Another local resident said, if they would just give us some decent firefighting equipment, we would have an excellent firefighting department. Amy Avenue never had much chance of getting that excellent fire department or anything else. In the 1960s, the village of Indian Hill began buying up property on Amy Avenue and tearing the houses down. And Indian Hill doesn't even want the land, but they've got an idea. They think they can trade the land for something else. See, the city of Cincinnati has land that Indian Hill wants to own. Indian Hill officials figure that if they can put together a large enough contiguous parcel that maybe the city of Cincinnati would like, that maybe they can negotiate a swap. So parcel after parcel after parcel on Amy Avenue and in the rest of what would have been the Douglas Park subdivision is acquired by the village of Indian Hill. But there are still some holdout residents who don't want to sell their homes. And so in 1971, Alpheus White, who was the village manager of Indian Hill, gave an interview to a newspaper and said that Amy Avenue residents have jacked up prices to unrealistic levels. And he said, as a result, I doubt that any further purchases will be made in that area by the village. To be clear, the village manager of Indian Hill was complaining that home prices for African Americans in Madisonville were too high because they didn't want to sell their houses to him to see them torn down. The proposed land swap never went through. Eventually, the city of Cincinnati went ahead and annexed the Amy Avenue area, including the portions owned by the village of Indian Hill. City of Cincinnati officials condemned the remaining houses, the residents relocated, and firefighters, so often absent in the history of Amy Avenue, appeared to conduct controlled burns of the remaining structures. And that was the end of Amy Avenue. The 1960s as a whole were, of course, a period of great change, tumultuous change. This is the period when Amy Avenue was being destroyed. It was also the period when two major interstate highways were being constructed right through black neighborhoods in Cincinnati. People have to go someplace. Madisonville is one of those places. So things change rapidly. In 1960, Madisonville was 73% white and 27% black. 1970, 10 years later, influx of African Americans, white flight to the suburbs, you're now 40% white and 60% black. As the demographics change, neighborhood leadership does change as well. And in 1962, something good happens. The Madisonville Coordinating Committee is formed. This actually came out of the sesquicentennial. People had noticed how deeply divided the community was. People started to think, hey, we need to have some way for people to come together. The initial members of the Madisonville Coordinating Committee included 3 African Americans from Madisonville: Jerry Maxey, Reverend William Mosley from Trinity Missionary Baptist Church, and a man named George Crawford. There were also 2 well-known African Americans from Cincinnati: Virginia Keys Coffey, Lois Conyers, and then there were 4 white people from Madisonville, all of whom had good credentials. This was a high-wattage group. And in particular, George W. Crawford was just beginning a long period of public service. Within a few years, people start to call him Mr. Madisonville. He started out as just a member of the coordinating committee. He becomes the head of the coordinating committee, and he develops a long record working with youth groups, churches, business groups, really one of the most remarkable community leaders in Madisonville history. And these people, they start to get some traction, right? In 1966, Madisonville gets its first community center in this building, the old Danner's Motors building, which many of you will recognize because it's now our arts center, Artsville. And in 1969, Madisonville gets a swimming pool at Stewart Park, due largely to the efforts of Mildred Orr, who is pictured here at left and who also ran Hut Cafe. Then in the late 1960s, people realized that there's a need in Madisonville for affordable housing for seniors. And so a group is formed to try to do something about this, and the primary stakeholders are 4 churches, 2 black, 2 white. Reverend William Mosley is representing Trinity Missionary Baptist Church, and Reverend Council Harris is representing Gaines United Methodist Church. Then there's also the white Methodist Church and the Catholic Church, and the 5th mayor player in this group is George Crawford. And they get together and they say, we're going to create this thing, we're going to call it the Madisonville Home for the Elderly, and it works. It's opened in 1971, and this is the building. Today it's called Madison Villa, and it's still affordable senior housing. This is one of the great success stories in Madisonville history. When you look at a photo of the of the ribbon cutting, there's 15 people in this photo. 8 of them are black, 7 of them are white. Pretty good, huh? Right? This is good. Now, in the 70s as a whole, a very challenging time for Madisonville. There's a sharp decline in residential property values, and the major shopping district is just getting kicked in the teeth by Kenwood Mall, right? And at the same time, for African American community development, the 1960s are a period of remarkable productivity. In 1971, Reber Can says we should have a daycare center, and it's opened by 1972. In 1973, Trinity Church breaks ground on a new education center. That's William Moseley in the center of the photograph, and it's opened by 1974. Also in 1974, we get a new small public park. George Crawford is one of the speakers at the dedication, and then in the photo, that's James Rankin on the left, William Chenault on the right. Also in 1974, Madisonville gets a new city health clinic, which still exists in a newer location and is now named the Braxton Can Memorial Medical Center. In 1974, we also get a Kiwanis Club. The president is Neil Dunstan, who's shown here on the right. Some of the officers include George Crawford and Carl Westmoreland, and the Reverend Fred Heath, who has now come to Gaines United Methodist Church. The 1970s were banner years for the Wesley Smith Lodge, the African American Fraternal Lodge. And in the late 1970s, planning begins for a new industrial park called the Eastwood Industrial Park. Carl Westmoreland is one of the real leaders of this project, pushing this forward. And it works. The industrial park is built, and it becomes the corporate headquarters for U.S. Shoe and brings a lot of good-paying jobs to Madisonville. And there's a Coca-Cola facility and so on. I had the honor to sit down with Mr. Westmoreland, God rest his soul, about a year before he passed, and he was extremely proud of the work that he had done bringing U.S. Shoe to Madisonville. In 1979, Maxey's Funeral Home builds a new building. And also in 1979, ground is broken for the current facility of Gaines United Methodist Church. Ground was broken under the pastorate of Reverend Fred Heath, and the facility was open by 1980. So really, this is quite a remarkable string of successes, and African Americans are, for this whole decade, in the driver's seat for every development decision that gets made. What nobody can figure out is what to do about the business district, which has absolutely gotten killed by Kenwood Mall. The caption on this photo, this is from 1977, and the caption identifies this as the Madison and Wetzel corner and says, "Boarded over rot at the hub." And other storm winds are coming. In 1977, George Crawford abruptly resigns from the Madisonville Coordinating Committee. He's only 60, nobody's expecting him to go, and 2 months later he's dead. And George Crawford is shown in the right of the photo here. A later report about the Coordinating Committee says, for 11 years, Crawford, serving either as chairman or vice chairman, provided strong leadership. In response to his resignation, the MCC stated that his leadership was so totally dedicated, selfless, and effective that it would be extremely difficult to carry on without him. Worse, it's not just George Crawford. Braxton Can had died just a couple of years earlier in 1974. 1977, George Crawford dies, but that's also when William Moseley leaves Trinity, and then Jerry Maxey dies, David Benet dies, Reber Can dies, right? Now, new community leaders would emerge and have continued to emerge. Many of the Madisonville community leaders who came to prominence in the 1980s, 1990s, are still there and were and are doing a fantastic job advocating for Madisonville. But for whatever reason, by the early 1980s, people in Madisonville are having a hard time agreeing on what should happen next. And so we start to get, the headlines change, right? It's in Madisonville, struggle slows change. And this one also from 1981, development plan splits community, right? So the business district is in shambles. The previous generation of community leaders is gone. People are arguing about what should happen next, and then a drug crisis hits. Madisonville suffers from the drug crisis twice. Once from the sale and use of drugs, once from the unbelievably racist way that the war on drugs is conducted. I think people know now that in the 1980s, criminal penalties for the use of crack cocaine could be 100 times as severe as the penalties for the use of powdered cocaine that was favored by white people. But the Madison-Wetzel corner gets hit hard. This photograph on the left, the caption for that one says, go back a little bit, Pete, thank you. Go forward one. Go forward one more, please. Right, the caption says, motorists' impressions of Madisonville are often negative, gleaned from boarded up buildings and graffiti-covered walls. Thank you. So this is a march in downtown Madisonville in 1989. The man with the megaphone is Willie Cunningham, president of the Madisonville Crime Prevention Task Force. He has previously written a letter to the editor of the Cincinnati Herald, the black newspaper, in which he says, the major areas of concern are drugs, drug dealers, wayward teenagers, and irresponsible drinking establishments. And at the 1989 rally, the Cincinnati Enquirer reports, Willie Cunningham pointed to the row of boarded up and crumbling buildings. Supposedly, this is our business district, he said. The city's shopping district at the corner of Madison and Wetzel has become a center for loitering, muggings, and even several murders over the past few years, Cunningham said. Now, Madisonville during this whole time is basically a good neighborhood. It's a neighborhood where people take care of each other, look out after their families, and the overall crime rate in Madisonville as a whole is very comparable to the crime rate in other nearby neighborhoods. But that's not what people see driving through. The Madison-Wetzel corner is a mess, and it is a heavy drug area, right? So white perceptions of crime and safety do not make anything better, right? They only make things worse. By the late 80s, early 90s, a number of people have told me that that white women were fairly frequently counseled that they should not even drive through Madisonville, and that if they have to drive through Madisonville, they should roll up their windows and lock their doors. Well, of course, the perception is not as bad. The perception is worse, than the reality. But there's a period of time, a period of years, when the reality is very challenging indeed. By this time, some of those buildings downtown, they've been vacant since the early mid-'70s, and buildings are starting to deteriorate, and there's a cycle where sometimes a building will be so far gone that nobody wants to invest in fixing it up, and it gets condemned, and then it gets demolished. This is Willie Cunningham again in 1991, standing this time in front of a vacant lot. And the article is headlined, A March for Madisonville, and the subheading is Walk Planned to Highlight Eyesores Get City's Attention. Well, in 1991, we got the city's attention all right. Boy, did we get it, but not in a good way. In 1991, the city of Cincinnati issued its Madisonville Industrial Corridor Urban Renewal Plan. Now, this doesn't have anything to do with the center of Madisonville. This is all about the west edge of Madisonville on Red Bank Road. And you get a few pages into this report, and yes, you can, yeah, there we go. Within the Madisonville Industrial Corridor, there exist blighted areas in which a majority of the structures are detrimental to the public health, safety, morals, and general welfare. Sub-area A, formerly known as Dunbar, blah, 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 eminent domain, right? What the city is proposing here is the wholesale demolition of Dunbar, a poor but vibrant African-American neighborhood. This is a horrendous idea, the worst possible response to the genuine problems that Madisonville's got. Dunbar is home to people like the Peterson family and Tony Smoots, who was a cement contractor, and Denise Anderson and Roy Smoots Allen. In the heyday of Dunbar, which was early mid-20th century, there were maybe 50 houses in Dunbar. There were two churches, both Baptist, New Mission, Missionary Baptist Church, and a smaller Primitive Baptist Church, and there was a small grocery. No, that's okay. You can go on in advance. There we go. In 1970, construction of the Red Bank Expressway, which is shown here, dashed in purple at left. It sort of clips the edge of Dunbar, results in the demolition of around 10 houses. And Dunbar by this time has suffered from decades of redlining by banks, which means that Dunbar residents can't get home improvement loans. And then there are the usual suspects. There's racial disparities in pay for workers. There's disparities in policing and sentencing. Many of the houses in Dunbar were small to begin with. This was the home of Henry Lohman. And by this time, many of the houses are run down. Not all of the houses are run down. You recognize this one. This is the home of Cordelia Rollins, now lived in by her son, Wiley Rollins, and his wife, Eva. And in 1992, after the city plan was announced, a reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer came out and visited the Rollinses and wrote about the home where they lived, how tidy it was, how it showed the care of 2 generations of home ownership. The house was built in 1906 by Wiley Rollins' father after he came up from Tennessee. The Enquirer reporter wrote about the grape arbor in back, and about the rows of Sharon hedge in front, and about the TV room that was added in the 1950s, and the big barbecue pit. And they interviewed Eva Rollins. She said, "How can you fight City Hall? We just don't need a house like this anyhow. They're going to take it, so let them take it." I've spoken to a number of people who formerly lived in Dunbar, and many of them expressed these same feelings. Everyone I've spoken to expressed these same feelings of powerlessness. They wanted to stay in Dunbar, they loved their homes, and just didn't feel that they had a choice, and did not feel that they had a voice. Of course, it should not have taken organized opposition from within the Dunbar community to keep this from happening. White people in Madisonville should have gotten up in arms about this and should have protested. And I am sorry to say that Madisonville did not rise to the occasion. Things moved quickly after that. By the mid-1990s, the property's been acquired. The houses are bulldozed. This is Red Bank Expressway coming through on the left, and the area becomes a commercial zone. There have been sort of attempts at continuity. New Mission Baptist Church in a newer location is still a vital Madisonville institution. Many of the original Dunbar families still live in Madisonville, and there have been occasional Dunbar reunions. But the destruction of Dunbar remains a gaping wound in the cultural consciousness of Madisonville. So all of this is happening, and meanwhile, back at the center of the business district, nothing has improved. In 1999, Menino's Market, the last real cornerstone business of downtown Madisonville, closes its doors for the last time. And by the mid to late 2000s, the Madisonville downtown looks like this, or at least a lot of it does. That's the Benet Barbershop building in the background, which by this time had been vacant for decades. There had been a large building in the foreground, but it had been mostly unoccupied for 20 years. It had deteriorated. The Cincinnati Director of Buildings and Inspections came out and looked and said, "Look, this thing is full of pigeon poop and it's full of asbestos. It's a health hazard and it's got to come down." So down it came. It didn't come down to make way for new development. It came down because there wasn't any new development in Madisonville, and nobody knew whether there could be any or not. Well, anyone who has driven down Madison Road recently or down Wetzel Avenue knows it doesn't look like this anymore. Now it looks like this, right? Now, some people in Madisonville, a lot of people in Madisonville love the new buildings, and a lot of people in Madisonville despise the new buildings, right? So let's talk about both. There is, in fact, a good bit to love. Now, this is the same view. That's the Benet Barbershop building in the background. The new buildings are the apartments on the upper levels on both the left and the right are 80% market rate, 20% means tested affordable housing, and there are legitimate questions about how affordability should be calculated, but that's better than just 100% market rate. A lot of people were just worried that that if new construction ever came to the Madison and Wetzel corner, that it would just be gas stations and fast food. And people wanted an urban corner, and they wanted something with some civic presence. So that was important. Part of the package deal for the development was the restoration and saving the Benet Barbershop building, which is in the background. The health clinic was enlarged as a part of this process. There was a years-long process of public input and public meeting after public meeting that involved selecting a developer, finding the right developer, and approving the conceptual plans. Getting this plaza that you see in front of the building on the right, that was a major goal of the community. There's lots of seating walls there for just people to just hang out. And this will also be used for public gatherings, maybe an art show, who knows, maybe a farmer's market. And the anchor tenant of the building on the right will be a new Madisonville branch of the Cincinnati Public Library, doubling the size of the current Madisonville branch and making the Madisonville Library for the first time wheelchair accessible. So if you're going to have something other than that vacant lot, you could do a lot worse than this. And at the same time, over the last 15 years, real estate prices, home prices in Madisonville have risen very dramatically. If you grew up in Madisonville believing that someday you would be able to buy a home in Madisonville, and now you can't, it's probably pretty hard to look at those buildings without feeling like those buildings must have something to do with that, right? So affordable housing has really risen to the fore as I think the defining issue that we face, because it isn't just here. Over the same period of time, that real estate prices were rising in Madisonville, that was happening other places, and now there's a widespread crisis of affordable housing across the entire Cincinnati region. So as I said, I think that's perhaps the defining issue that we face today. But home is more than housing. Even for African Americans in Madisonville who own their own homes and who have plenty of money to pay the property taxes, many of them have expressed that Madisonville feels less special than it used to, and feels less distinct, and feels less like home. Regardless of the causes behind changes in demographics or market trends, that loss of a sense of home is a profound loss. So what's next for Madisonville? I don't know. I only know that something's going to happen next, right? Because there's actually still a good bit of vacant land pretty close to our business district, and there are, along our commercial streets, many unused and underused historic buildings. Whether you love the new buildings or you hate them, if you've got a good idea about what can happen next in Madisonville, then Madisonville needs you and needs to hear your voice. In the process of that conversation, I hope we will take heed of past injustices. I also hope that we'll maybe take a little bit of inspiration from Madisonville's many past heroes and occasional past successes. I want to thank the Harriet Beecher Stowe House for having me, and the First Unitarian Church for being the host. I want to thank Robert Brana and Janet Blank for sharing some of their photos with me. And I want to give a special shout out of thanks to all of my neighbors in Madisonville. I moved to Madisonville 29 years ago, and it is you, my neighbors, who have made Madisonville, for me, a good place to live. Thank you very much.
We do have questions and answers now. If you're in the audience here, raise your hand and we'll bring the mic around. If you're watching online, type your questions in the chat feature and we'll be monitoring and you can ask those questions as well. So, saw the first hand right here. You went up pretty quickly.
Hi, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I moved to Madisonville about a year ago, and so I have lots of questions. But I'm curious about the empty lot that is at the corner of Erie and Wetzel. And because my daughter came to visit, and we took her dog walking there. It was great, but I was curious about what a big empty lot there was doing and researched it and found out that I think it was the site of an old laundry.
Yes.
And that it is, that it's toxic, I guess?
It was a brownfield facility as I don't know the current status of the remediation. There's other people in this room who would know the answer to that question. So catch me after the lecture and we'll find out the right person who knows the answer to that.
Next hand, I'll come over there.
Where was the Dunbar area? Because I know that part of that where the Coke building is now?
It's where the Christ Hospital on Red Bank Expressway, where the Christ Hospital outpatient facility is, and the Heights Center of Excellence that was formerly the Gorilla Glue Factory. It's back in that area. Thank you. Yeah.
I just have a question. When you were talking, you were speaking about the Amy area and
Yes, ma'am.
how it wasn't City of Cincinnati and it wasn't Indian Hill.
Yes.
Where did the kids go to school?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not actually sure. Anybody know? Okay, we have somebody here who knows. They went to Madisonville School. The question was, since Amy Avenue was not part of Cincinnati or not part of Indian Hill, where did the children go to school? And Reverend Buford, whose family still owns property in this area, says they went to Madisonville School. And Lyons, thank you. Okay.
There was somebody right back here in the middle. Back here. I think it was you, sir.
I talked with Chris a little before, and out on the table there's a timeline from 2002 for the Recreation Center that shows the history put together by Ruth Bazalt when she was commissioned for the panels that was put up for their community center. But my research and work that I've done for my master's over at Mount St. Joe goes back to the First Methodist Church back in around 1808 and 1809, and shortly afterwards Madisonville was noted for the first free slave community north of the Ohio River. And it was based in that area that a lot of African American families moved to Madisonville because it was the first free slave community north of the Ohio River, and basically became like the founding seed for the Dunbar community because of that. But it's a historical fact that I haven't been able to get the rest of the historians of Cincinnati to recognize. But in my research earlier, back around 2007 to 2006, 2007, it was in the early histories of the Madisonville Methodist Church.
Yeah, Madisonville at its inception was a heavily Methodist community. All of the early founding families were devout Methodists. The first church in Madisonville was a log Methodist meeting house put up by Uzziel Ward in the very early days. And the Madisonville Methodist Church, Methodists in the South, developed some sort of moral flexibility on the issue of slavery. But in the Cincinnati Conference, the Methodist Church took a very strong anti-slavery stance, and there were large Methodist meetings down on Duck Creek that thousands of people would come out from Cincinnati, and there was significant African American participation in those in the 1850s, what was called the Duck Creek Camp Meeting. So I have to believe, I mentioned Peter Rooker, who appears in the census of 1820, he's living next door to a Methodist minister. So I have to believe that the heavy Methodist influence in Madisonville early on did help it to become a more welcoming place for both fugitive African Americans and eventually for African Americans who settled here. But some of the early history is a little hard to tie down.
Chris, so Bill Collins is watching online and he asks, can you say a few words about Charles Lewis Metz and groundbreaking archaeological work on indigenous cultures done at the Madisonville site?
Sure. What is known as the Madisonville site is in Marymount, and it's one of the most important sites for Native American artifacts in the United States. And during the 1870s, excavations began there by a Madisonville resident named Charles Lewis Metz, whose home still exists. It's on Madisonville Road. It's a terrific place. And he was very involved, along with archaeologists from Harvard, excavating this area. And, perhaps had a more enlightened idea than many people did at the time about Native peoples and their cultures and so on and so forth. So he's certainly one of Madisonville's guiding lights. Yes, ma'am. Is that? Oh, sorry, I shouldn't.
I'm next.
Mike's over there.
Mike's right here, and then Miss Angela. So, Chris, I want to thank you. That was excellent. Very good. Very enlightening. About the Madisonville archaeological dig, I think there's a postscript to that some may want to read about, and maybe you know about the remains that were taken from that site and what's Harvard having to atone for some of that, but everyone can read up on it, so I don't want to get the facts wrong. Now to my question, Peter Rucker, I noticed on the census information that you had up there, it looked like there was a column for whether or not people owned slaves.
Yes,
And
so they
I was
used the
surprised
same
to see
census
that.
form, both north and south.
Oh, okay.
So in this form it says slaves, and then immediately under there it says none, because it's always going to say none in Ohio.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I want to say thank you to Chris for this great and thoughtful research that you've done. And I include thoughtful in there because Madisonville's demise over the last 100 years has been basically brought on by its annexation to Cincinnati. Actually, Madisonville started dying as soon as Cincinnati started consuming
You're
it.
sitting next to a city council member.
Yeah, I know
so
that.
careful what you say.
That's exactly why I'm saying this. and so for that reason, I just want to say this about Madisonville that Chris has just outlined. What he has just outlined is that, first of all, the oldest black cemetery in Ohio is in Madisonville. The oldest black communities are on Little Red Bank, Little Duck Creek, and Big Duck Creek. Black people couldn't live in Madisonville, but they could live on the edges of it. And Madisonville was more developed than any other place in Cincinnati because it had access to fugitive slave labor that was coming across the Ohio River that's at its narrowest and shallowest right there. So I just want to say this. I think that Madisonville should be, from top to bottom, be designated as an Underground Railroad historical site, museum site. The museum downtown means nothing without Madisonville. My ancestors moved there over 100 years ago onto the land that was dedicated to the memory of Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington, two people who have been born in slavery. So then there's a message that the ancestors have given us that we need to protect that history. No matter how these modern buildings come in, there needs to be a sign in the middle of Wetzel and Madisonville for Henry B. Wetzel. And I'll just say this about where you just asked about model laundry. You know who lived across the street from there? Henry B. Wetzel. So that when that railroad was being built, that was finished before the Civil War in 1841, he was watching fugitive slaves build the B&O Railroad extension right in his front yard. So that's history that white people should know about, particularly young white people. And so I'm just saying passionately that all of Madisonville should be known as an Underground Railroad Historical District, and the area where my family bought land, the Cresap's Douglas subdivision, that be turned into a national park. I've already developed our land into a nature preserve within that, and I'm still paying taxes on it. And I'm going to say that it's bordered by Cincinnati, Indian Hill, Hamilton County, et cetera. I think that in this generation, what we could do, while the character of Madisonville is changing to these box-type buildings, that we should preserve its history with the appropriate historical signs. And I want to give you credit for creating a lot of that sign. Thank you.
Reverend Buford, thank you. This is a great point, right? How do we get the word out? You know, I've talked to people in a couple of community organizations and said, you know, we have a lot of streets and parks named for white people. Let's rename some streets. Let's rename some parks. Let's get a statue of Jenny Bryan. Let's figure out, you know, what we need to do so that history can move forward and be more widely known and be widely shared. So thank you. Oh, since we're on the subject, I have to thank Reverend Buford and Councilmember Jeffries for providing the impetus and leadership that for the first time is going to get a historical marker for Dunbar. And historical marker is not enough, but it's a great start, so thank you.
Hi, my name is Angela Pearson, and I live in Madisonville. I was raised and born in Madisonville. I see Madisonville come, and I see it go. And first of all, I want to give thanks to the Most High, and I want to thank you for putting so much interest in true history and telling the true history. Thank you for your integrity. I appreciate
Thanks, Ms.
you
Pearson.
for that.
I appreciate it.
But anyway, so getting back, about 4 years ago, I was out in my yard. I like to garden. It was two white men riding on horses. And so both of them was raised and born in Madisonville. So it was giving me a little history of Madisonville. So the history was that his third great-grandfather was put in Madisonville because he was part of cavalry. So was there a military cavalry that was stationed in Madisonville that you know of? But anyway, he said it was a military station here in Madisonville. And I said, for what? He said, because to kill off, I start crying. He said to kill off the Indians. He didn't say to run them out. He said to kill them. I said, that is egregious, inhuman. Why is that? People always gotta come into somebody else's territory and murder and kill and rape and steal and plunder. And they want to call it discovered. That's a word that should be taken out of our history, discovered. Let's tell the truth. We all are here on this planet to enjoy this planet, enjoy life. Hopefully one day, King's dream is that we all be equal and be fair with each other. But anyway, so I see the development in Madisonville. It's beautiful. But guess what? There's a lot of people that look like me, feel like that we are excluded. We're not included in this. We've been living here all my life. All my life, a lot of African Americans. And I hear some white people say, well, that's sad. What can I do about it? Because we have a lot of African Americans that's been pushed out of our neighborhoods that we've been knowing ever since I was born, ever since blacks have migrated to Madisonville, just like you said, a lot of slaves come here and work the railroads and help build this country. And we still not equal, not treated like human beings. All I can say is I hope that the people who's moving into Madisonville today try to work with everyone, because it's not just your community because you're just moving in. It's all of our community. You know what? Black people have put taxes in this community for many, many, many years. And now we're getting pushed out because we have no power, economical base, and we still been treated as we're inhuman. So when is America is going to wake up? Because I'm not going nowhere. I will fight to the end. You're not going to push, I'm not going to let them push me out of my community. I'm going to stand up for my community, what is right. Because like I said, this world belongs to all of us. So I'm hoping that we can come together and start coming to these meetings. Every third Thursday in Madisonville, we have, every third Thursday and each month, we have our community council meeting. Let's come and make Madisonville a great community. It can be a great community if we stop looking at each other by color. Look at each other by human beings. And that's all I ask. That's all we all ask. Let's come and make it the growth and development of Madisonville, not just for one culture, but all of us. That's all I ask. Thank you.
Before the next question, I just want to say thank you, Angie Pearson. Ms. Pearson is one of Madisonville's bright lights and somebody I really admire and somebody I think we can all learn a lot from. So thank you, Ms. Pearson.
Hi, my name is Marla Willis-Givens, and I'm actually a granddaughter of Katie Willis.
Oh.
That house was burned. It's
Wow.
Katie, not Catherine, but it's Katie. But my question is about the other cemetery that's very old in Madisonville that you didn't touch on.
United American Cemetery, I did not touch on because don't get me started. But if the good folks at Harriet Beecher Stowe House will agree to have me back on their lecture series next year, then we'll take an hour and just talk about United American Cemetery. Does that sound good? Okay.
Just quickly, wanted to say thank you as a descendant of Katie Willis. We're
Wow.
thankful to touch on the history and everything like that. It's very nice. Yeah, memories as well. Yeah, and we also Amy Avenue. Family still owns the land, so we like to connect with you after.
All right. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you to our wonderful audience, both here and online. We have a full slate of lectures, discussion groups, and specialty tours happening in 2023. And as the house restoration continues through the interior, we're also increasing our engagement and education throughout the community. Check out our website at stowehousecincy.org to see program updates or to book a speaker. We'll hang out for a short while here in the atrium for a more informal chat, and I believe the donation box is still out there. There should be some snacks left as well, so help yourself. So thank you all, and let's give one more round of applause to Mr. Hanlin.
Thank you all very much.